Everybody, welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. Thanks so much for joining us live on Facebook. We really appreciate that you're here. We are talking all things education as we do on these Tuesday mornings. And of course, we would love to see your comments, your thoughts. And as always, my partner in crime, Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, sporting a new haircut finally. You look great.
Yes. It was about 5 months, actually, but because it was right before the legislative session, and obviously, obviously these things were on hold, and it's it was a long time. I think
Yes.
toddlerhood was the last time it was a 5 month delay for a haircut for me.
Well, Kevin looking handsome and doing his job, as he always has, with Idaho Ed News. If you would like the very latest information from education news around the state of Idaho, of course, idahoednews.org, the place to go. And again, we engage your comments and your thoughts as we have a number of topics to talk about. And Kevin, I wanted to start with you with the State Board of Education's meeting yesterday, because they kind of decided where to spend quite a bit of money. This is called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. And first of all, we should mention to people that as they've been watching and listening to Making the Grade, there was the CARES Act money that came through, some $40+ million for K through 12 education. This is an additional $15 million. And the governor kind of gets to decide, correct, how this gets worked out.
Right. So this is really at the governor's discretion. So what the state board recommended is just that. These are recommendations, and it'll ultimately be up to the governor to decide where this $15.7 million goes. And this is separate from a pot of money of about, I want to say about $48 million that is earmarked for K-12, and about, I want to say about $37 million that is earmarked for higher education. This is money that the governor can decide what to do with. And what the state board recommended was a menu of several options, including some money to help higher education deal with remote learning, if that's what it comes to, trying to move some CTE classes into a remote setting. But it's ultimately going to be up to the governor to decide where that $15.7 million goes.
So the State Board of Education met yesterday to basically propose their recommendations. One that I wanted to hit on, Kevin, with this, which I think a lot of parents are going to be curious about in K through 12 education, is that the State Board decided they would like to see more money given to Idaho Public Television and the Idaho Digital Learning Academy in order to support kindergarten through 6th grade curriculum. And we saw some of this during the beginning stages of the pandemic, where Idaho Public Television really stepped up and tried to hook up with teachers to provide curriculum to parents. And this will go into our tech divide conversation as well. Yeah. But it's interesting to me that they're looking at these outside resources as an immediate way to try and help parents who are maybe going to have to be doing some online learning at home.
Right. You're absolutely right about public television. They played a pivotal role very quickly in trying to get digital learning materials in the hands of students. So what the state board is recommending is just trying to build upon that, building upon what public TV is doing, what IDLA is already doing. Again, and this is all with a view towards the fall and what may or may not happen in the fall with a resumption of normal classroom instruction, because nobody knows what we're going to see here in 3 months.
You did an excellent piece at Idaho Ed News on technology divides. We're looking at it right now here on the screen. And it stemmed from the State Department of Education's survey that they did. And they classified that this was not a highly scientific survey. They were just trying to get an idea of the technological divide in our state. We all know it's there, but how deep is it? Because as we start to look at schools reopening in the fall and how that works, you have to know whether or not students, one, have broadband connectivity, and two, have the devices. So what did the State Department of Education find, and what's going to have to happen in order to bridge the divide?
Well, so what the State Department found, and it's not complete, because barely half of the districts and charters across the state responded to this survey. It wasn't a mandatory survey. It was optional. So a lot of districts and charters didn't participate, but the State Department of Education did get responses representing about 2/3 of the students across the state. And what the department found was that when you total up the numbers of students who don't have access to the internet at home, or they don't have access to a device that they can use at home, you get a sense, between those two numbers, by our math, you've got about 27% of students, give or take, that don't have access. It's probably less, because students who don't have access to the internet may also be students who don't have access to a device. So adding up the numbers of students who don't have devices, or report that they don't have devices, and report that they don't have internet, is really a high-end estimate, if that makes sense, because there's got to be overlap between the two.
That's very true. 15% for the public school students with no access to broadband, 12% with no access to a device. Exactly.
And what Superintendent Ibarra has been saying in multiple public forums over the past few weeks is that their estimate is that it's about 30% of students who are in a digital divide. So the numbers don't quite get you there. There's not you can't add up those numbers and get to 30%. But what the department is saying is it's about 30% has been their assertion. And what the department then said, as we crunch the numbers and analyze them and ask more, is digital gap. It's still a concern to them. Why is this all important? It's important because at this point in time, the State Board of Education is trying to decide how to spend some of that stimulus money that we were just talking about, whether to spend some of that money on an instructional management system that would help schools bridge that technology divide if we get to the point where remote learning has to continue in the fall, or schools have to return to remote learning at some point during the school year next year, because we don't know what's going to happen. I keep saying that over and over, and it's so obvious to say it, but you have to keep it top of mind here that nobody in education knows exactly what the landscape is going to look like in August and September and beyond.
No parents do either, obviously.
No, of course. We're all in this unknown. And what you have to be doing, and I think what the State Board is trying to do, is plan for any eventuality, whether that's resumption of education as we knew it before March, or if it's a modified version of education in the classroom, whether it's some sort of a hybrid between classroom instruction with some remote learning thrown in. We just don't know what it's going to look like. And we don't know what it's going to look like from community to community, because we don't know what the coronavirus is going to look like from community to community in the fall and beyond.
And when we come back to those technology divides, I want to go back to the story that Idaho Ed News did, because there's a really interesting map, and we're showing superintendents met as well, talking about next fall. But there's an interesting map that you guys put out when it comes to an interactive ability to kind of click on and see what school districts, first of all, answered this survey from the State Department of Education on technology, and then specifically where some school districts stand. And I would encourage people to, there's the map right there, to be able to click on some of those. You talk about, even in our area here, Kevin, obviously most of the people watching us, not necessarily out in rural communities, but right here in the heart of Boise and Meridian, Eagle and Star. And those numbers are kind of what I would assume people would suspect, although the Boise School District reporting 5% of its students being in this desert of technology, West Ada reporting 10% of students. And then we got to CUNA, which was interesting to me, and CUNA was reporting 40%. So I say, that CUNA's right here, right, with us, and yet the dichotomy of what this looks like for students can be vastly different. We're not just talking about, Lapway, where you would expect this digital divide to come in, which Lapway was huge, like 80% reporting that digital divide.
Yeah, you can play around on the map if you're curious to see how this divide shakes out from community to community. And you're absolutely right. The disparity between communities can be really stark. And I'm glad you pointed out the Treasure Valley. 40% of students in CUNA without access to internet. That's a huge number, especially when you look at the other districts around CUNA. What was it, 5% in Boise, 10% in West Ada, and I think it was something like 12% in Nampa. That is a very large disparity involving a community that's really close to the heart of Idaho's population center. It's really, really surprising. And yes, as you look into some of these rural districts, you'll see even higher numbers. That's kind of what we expected going in, and that's kind of what we've assumed about the technology gap going into this pandemic. But the more we've learned about the technology divides and the gaps in terms of access, it's not what you would expect. It's not as clean and as linear as you would expect. That urban districts are in fairly good shape and rural districts are really struggling with this. It really varies from community to community, and that's going to be part of the challenge for the state moving forward.
Well, and as we're here live on Facebook talking with Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News, I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. This is an interesting comment. I wanted to bring this in. Jenny Lee Coffin saying, even with computer access and internet at home, many parents cannot assist them. Many parents like myself, she's look at this. I have a teaching degree, but you can't help them beyond their average work schedule of parents. A child in middle school, straight A student, but she was unable to do online schooling at all. Many students cannot do online schooling. And I can kind of relate to Jenny Lee here because in our household, we feel very blessed, right? I have a computer, my husband has a computer, and we have our home computer. But when you have perhaps two adults working from home and then multiple students who are supposed to then be online learning their students, we're short a device here, Kevin. Mm-hmm. So the digital divide isn't just the haves and the have-nots, although that is there without a doubt. And a lot of what's being discussed has to do with the poverty rate in many of these communities, especially when it comes to broadband access. So this is another digital divide, and I think Jenny Lee brings up a good point.
Mm-hmm. No, she absolutely does. And I've heard that from other educators in other communities where, if you've got a large family, if you've got 4 or 5 kids in the school system, even if the school district sends the kids home with a school issued device, a Chromebook or a laptop, but they only issue 1 or 2 maybe devices to that household because there are only so many to go around. Well, then you've got kids within that family having to divvy up their time on the laptop or divvy up their time on the Chromebook. So, who gets to do classwork when, who gets to turn in assignments when, and teachers have to adjust to what the kids are having to do at home and what the parents are having to sort out with their kids. It's a very complicated situation, and so much that parents had to work through, so much that kids had to work through, so much that educators had to work through within that short window of time that we had in late March, April, May.
And as we start to talk about schools reopening in the fall, we got a preview of it there. The superintendents, at least a few of them, met with State Superintendent Sherry Barr to kind of give an update. Let me bring in Kim Welch here, who's talking about how it's going to take a Herculean effort to keep children at a social distance as they go back to schools and what that really looks like. And it was interesting to me in the article that Idaho Ed News did, Kevin, that you really focused in on that because what you would expect, small rural districts in this case, might actually have a much better chance than, say, a Boise or a West Ada that has this ridiculous amount of overpopulation of classrooms, students to begin with. And, it's really true. The difference in how education is going to look in the fall is going to vary so much across this state.
It really is. And it's going to be a different problem for different districts to solve. And let's maybe just talk about 2 districts that are going to face this from very different perspectives. West Ada, we have chronicled West Ada's crowding issues for years. Classes with 25, 30 or more students. How do you socially distance when you have a class of 30 or so elementary school students? Well, I'm not a teacher, but I think I pretty much know the answer. You can't socially distance with that many kids in a classroom. It's physically impossible. So it's going to be a real challenge for these larger districts with these larger student populations to figure out, where do you put all these kids, and how do you maintain some sort of distancing? It's going to be next to impossible. We heard last week in that webinar from the Bliss School District, and Bliss is a very different scenario entirely from West Ada. I don't know if you've driven through Bliss. I've driven through once or twice. It's a small town, and it is in the middle of farm and ranch country in Gooding County. And the superintendent there is saying, I don't want to even think about a plan B. I don't even want to think about contingencies. We're coming back in the fall. And he's saying, look, we only have a handful of kids in a class anyway. We have 10 students in many classes because that's all we have in Bliss. That's all we have at a grade level in Bliss. And he's right about that. But I look at a community like Bliss, and I look at what's happening right now in Gooding County and in that Magic Valley with the coronavirus case numbers that you're seeing. That's been a hotspot for coronavirus spread across the state. And it's been pretty well chronicled what's happened the past couple of weeks with outbreaks tied to food processing plants in the Magic Valley. Now, that's what's happening right now. We don't know what's going to be happening in the fall. We don't know what's going to be happening in those plants, in those communities, but we've seen what can happen. And, let's fast forward to the fall. Even in a really small school district like Bliss, even in a district with small class sizes, if you're in a community in the middle of an outbreak, if Gooding County becomes a hotspot for coronavirus in the fall or beyond, and we obviously hope it doesn't happen, but you have to think about what would happen if it were to unfold that way. What do you do in a school like Bliss, even though you only have a handful of students? What do you do, and how do you reconcile classroom instruction with trying to maintain some sort of control over the spread of the virus? That's going to be a really difficult decision for a small district. It's going to be a difficult decision in the larger districts. Nobody's going to have an easy go of this come the fall.
Well, and parents are going to obviously have a say too. It was interesting here. Adriana is saying that maybe have kids that can learn at home, stay home, so that the kids who actually need to be watched or have limited access to the internet can have that time to do that socially distancing. And there are going to have to be so many different rules, for lack of a better term here, right? So many different tactics that each school district is going to have to take. And whether or not you're in Bliss or in West Ada, things, as you're saying, could change on a dime, Kevin.
Right. And I think what she's getting at with that comment, and it's a really good point, is, kids learn differently, and parents assess how their kids learn differently. So one of the things that's going to be really important to watch when we resume classes in the fall is, what do parents do? Do parents make the decision to, move their kids into an online learning environment or into a homeschooling environment because they're concerned about sending their kids back into school? Again, depending on what's going on with coronavirus here in Idaho. Now, what sort of choices do parents make with their kids? One thing I wrote about last week, USA Today did a national survey, and it revealed that there are, a lot of parents who are concerned about sending their kids back to school in the midst of this pandemic until there's a vaccine in place. And we know there's not going to be a vaccine in place for quite a few months. So parents are going to have to make that decision in August and September in the absence of a coronavirus vaccine. It's going to be very interesting to see what enrollment numbers look like in the traditional schools, what enrollment numbers look like in the virtual schools and the virtual charter schools. A lot to watch as we head into a very uncertain and unprecedented school year.
One of the stories also that both Idaho News 6 and Idaho Education News covered in the past week too, that goes right to the heart of this, is Crush the Curve. and their efforts in order to try and help schools open up in the fall. And one of the things they're doing is having a partnership with a company out of San Francisco that literally is providing thermometers. So it's also going to be interesting, Kevin, for me to watch as not only a parent and how I feel about perhaps my child's temperature being taken before school, if that's even a physically possible idea. And my kids, I'm sure, along with many of you, keep asking, am I going to wear a mask when I go back to school? All of these quote unquote social norms that so many people are facing in their personal lives, in their work lives now with what they have to do. What is appropriate for children? What is necessary for children? And again, don't you think that it's going to be up to each individual school district to try and figure this out?
It is going to be up to the districts to decide, and it's going to also come down to what's doable, what's feasible, what's affordable, what's available. So you talk about the smart thermometer partnership, and that could be a fairly big deal if it plays out as the partnership hopes. I mean, they're hoping to get 65,000 or so of these smart thermometers in the hands of parents, so they can get a sense across the state of what's happening in communities, in schools, to maybe try to identify if there's a hot spot, something that, outside of the norm, something that fevers that are outside of what you would normally expect to see, so that you could come back in and maybe do some testing to see if students are positive for coronavirus, and maybe test staff to see if they're positive for the coronavirus. You do know that at some point here the resources are limited. Governor Little as much as said it a couple of days ago and said, we're not going to be able to test every kid. We're not going to be able to do 300,000 coronavirus tests for every student in the K-12 system. So you're going to have to be strategic, and you're going to have to make some hard decisions about where do you do that testing, and do you use data like this smart thermometer partnership could produce. Do you use that data to say something's going on in this community? There are fever rates that are out of whack. This is a place where maybe we need to do some testing. Do you go into a community where there's been an outbreak, maybe tied to a business or maybe tied to a manufacturing plant? The stuff we've seen in the past couple of weeks. Do you then say, hey, we better get into that school and we better test faculty, we better test staff, we better test students to the extent that we can? You've only got so many tests to go around, and it's been well chronicled that Idaho's, behind other states in terms of testing, and we're playing catch up. You won't have unlimited resources in the fall. You won't have unlimited resources in the winter. You're going to have to be smart with the resources you have to try to, to maximize the value of the research and the findings that you get.
Here's one parent's comment. Sheila's saying, I don't think my kids will go to school if they have to wear a mask all day or have their temperature taken every day. If he's still that bad a guess, it's online schooling, which sounds safer at this point, which again, if you're just joining us here on Facebook, Kevin and I were talking about how the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is about almost $16 million coming in from the federal government for the governor to decide where that should go into our education, K through public universities and colleges. It's going to be interesting to see how IDLA, the Idaho Digital Learning Academy, might actually really take off. It's been an option in everybody's lives here in Idaho for a few years now, but the number of students enrolling in online school could really shoot up as well.
I would expect that there's going to be a surge in online virtual enrollment going into the fall. And, let's be mindful of the history with online learning in Idaho, with the online virtual schools. These schools have struggled with academic performance over the course of several years. I mean, this has been tracked over several years, and that may be a reflection of demographics. A lot of times these online virtual schools have been sort of a de facto alternative school. Kids may be sent to to this environment for whatever reason. Maybe they're having trouble in a traditional school. Maybe they're, maybe they've been the victim of bullying. Maybe they've had other health issues, and it's really not, feasible for these students to attend a traditional school, so they're learning online. So it's a different demographic. It's been a different demographic in recent years, and I think that because of those demographic challenges, it's fair to say that that's contributed to some of the academic issues that these online virtual schools have experienced in recent years. So what does it look like next fall? If you have a surge in enrollment in these online virtual schools and maybe a different demographic makeup of those students, very interesting. And this is conjecture at this point, because again, I say it, I feel like I say it every couple of minutes on these segments. We don't know what things are going to look like in the fall. We don't know what the online virtual schools are going to look like in the fall, but I think it's fair to expect that there's going to be an uptick in enrollment. And what that uptick in enrollment looks like, how many kids, where they come from, what sort of background, what sort of academic achievement, what sort of performance that they had in traditional schools. We just don't know what it's all going to look like.
Let me bring in more comments coming in from Facebook right now. We really appreciate all of you engaging with us in this conversation, because it's going to take the entire village to make sure this works. So let me start with Shannon Tharp saying, just open schools and go from there. That's definitely been a thought somebody have had. The children are losing their social skills, she says, suffering from PTSD. So there's the balance there between opening schools and mental health for students and social skills that they may be losing. I get that. And then there's Casey Ann Gates Crawford said, many kids don't learn well online, without a doubt. Those that do should go for it. She's saying that her daughter is ready for real school again. I think kids, for the most part, are ready for real school, believe it or not. She's hoping summer will crush the virus. And then there's T.E. Duvall saying private schools, charter schools, we could set up homeschool portals, even for working parents. Basically, the point here that we need to create groups and set up the own education solutions for children that work. And so true. All of these comments are completely legitimate and very different comments, which just goes, Kevin, to the fact that every parent is feeling a different way, because we all have children who learn different ways. There are teachers who are dealing with this in different ways. And so let me bring up Matt Covey's comment here, because besides online virtual schooling, what permanent changes to education come out of the pandemic? And that is where we go hopeful, right? That maybe at the light at the end of the tunnel of all this is that education has changed, hopefully for the better, for each individual child in the end.
I go back to a comment that I heard from Rob Waite, who's the superintendent in the Shoshone School District. That's another rural district in the Magic Valley. One of the things that he noted, and Shoshone is a district with some demographic challenges. It's a fairly high poverty school district, and as I said, it's a rural school district. One of the things that he noticed in the spring was a lot more parental engagement, a lot more parental involvement. And, parents had to get involved. They had to be engaged, and they had to, figure out ways to reach out to teachers and vice versa. And he's hoping that on the other side of this, and, obviously like superintendents all across the state, he's hoping something looks more like normal in the fall. He wants kids back in the schools. He wants them back in the classrooms. But he's also hoping that the relationships that came out of parents and teachers really being forced to have ongoing conversations about what's going on at home. How are you supporting your kids at home? How can you best help your kids through this really difficult time? He's hoping that those conversations, and he's hoping that those relationships will carry over and will help help build a better symbiotic relationship between parents and educators in a new school year, and hopefully a more quote unquote normal school year. We'll see, but that may be one thing that really does change, and that may be one hopeful trend is, maybe out of all of this kind of forced, transformation, people had to change their roles, and people had to change their views about their roles. And, maybe that is something people build on moving forward. We'll see.
I certainly hope so. That's the hopeful part of the message for education right now. And the fact that it's summer. So, hooray, I'm not battling for a device in my family anymore. Before I let you go, Kev. Let's talk one more subject, because this has been something we've been following now for, it seems like 6 to 8 weeks. And if you're just joining us here on Making the Grade, let's bring people up to speed. The State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Sherry Ibarra, filed a lawsuit against the State Board of Education, of which she has a seat on, and the legislature. What she doesn't want is for 18 jobs in technology in her department to get transferred over to the State Board of Education. And what you've written about here at idahoednews.org is so vital and important, because you've been following this lawsuit every step of the way. And this is the week. June 5th, Friday, is when the Supreme Court will be hearing this case.
Yes.
And it's more a case, as you've pointed out, perhaps, of the job of the state superintendent and the role of that position constitutionally in our state than perhaps even over money or a transfer of jobs. So what are you seeing coming out of this week?
Well, so I was really struck in the story that you're looking at that we're scrolling through right now. I was really struck by some of the exhibits that Sherry Ibarra's attorney filed about a week and a half ago. This chronology that Superintendent Ibarra collected over the course of the 2020 legislative session, and this chronology that Marilyn Whitney, Ibarra's point person at the State House, aggregated over the course of the legislative session, a chronicle of their conversations with legislators and state officials about not just the transfer of these 18 positions and the transfer of the $2.7 million. Their assertion is that there are legislators who flat out want to change the superintendent's position entirely, that want to pursue the idea of going from an elected state superintendent to an appointed state superintendent. And that's more common nationally than what we have here in Idaho. Idaho is one of only 13 states that elects a state superintendent. So, what both Ibarra and Whitney are laying out is this narrative, and again, it's just one side of the story, it's their narrative, of legislators who wanted to dismantle this department, be it by converting it into an appointed position or by defunding the department, beginning with this step to move IT and data management positions out of Ibarra's department and into the State Board of Education. So it really, the narrative, and then why I kind of jumped on the narrative and why I wrote about the narrative last week, was that whether you agree with it or not, it gives you a sense of the mindset within the Department of Education that Superintendent Ibarra really feels like her department is under attack, under siege. And again, whether you agree with her assessment of it or not, it gives you a sense of why does she feel like it's so important to pursue this lawsuit in the middle of this pandemic when we're cutting education budgets. Why are we spending potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in a courtroom battle over 18 positions and $2.7 million of funding that isn't going away? It's just moving from one department to another. At least now I understand a little bit better why has Superintendent Ibarra made this such a big deal, and why has she made this such a priority in these really difficult times for education. So that's why I jumped into it. And worth noting that even these documents are in dispute. An attorney for the legislature filed a motion last week saying that these should be stricken from the record because it's all hearsay. And, Ibarra's attorney, David Leroy, filed a response to that. I got a hold of that this morning. I'm going to be writing about it later in the day. So, as you would expect, lawyers disagree, lawyers debate, lawyers, go back and forth on things. So that's what's going on right now. So even, the relevance of these comments from Ibarra and Whitney are open to dispute. So we'll get a much better sense of where this case is going on Friday. As you mentioned, oral arguments on Friday morning. We'll be watching those via Zoom. It will be our first chance to really see how the 5 Supreme Court justices are viewing the case. What sort of questions do they ask? What sort of, who's on the hot seat on Friday morning, right? I mean, are the questions more directed at, Ibarra's attorney? Or are they more directed at the legislature's attorney or the State Board of Education's attorney? Because, you have 3 different legal teams, three different lawyers representing the three different entities, you know.
And taxpayers paying for it all, Kevin, just to interrupt. And taxpayers pay for all three.
Yeah, that's true.
I agree with you. We're going to be interested to watch that via Zoom. We should mention, though, in case people haven't been joining us every week and been following along with this, just so you know that the way education departments are set up varies from state to state. And there are plenty of states that actually appoint their state superintendent or have their state board of education be separate, perhaps from a state board of education who might handle K through 12 education, and a whole different, perhaps, regents board, if you look at California, who handles higher education. Here in Idaho, we have two separate institutions, the State Board of Education, who handles K, kindergarten through the university system, and then the State Department of Education, that's Superintendent Sherry Ibarra, and she's an elected official who works directly with K through 12. So just to clarify there, so everybody realizes that this isn't a one-size-fits-all mandate in how states handle their education departments.
Right, and the quick civics lesson here is that the elected position of superintendent of public instruction, that is baked into our Constitution. So to convert from an elected superintendent of public instruction to an appointed superintendent of public instruction, that would require a constitutional amendment, and that requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. That's a pretty daunting hurdle right there. And then you have to take that proposed amendment to the people, and it has to get majority support at the polls. And the last time a state tried to do this was 2 years ago. This is South Carolina, constitutional amendment to do pretty much what we're talking about, failed by a wide margin. I believe about 60% of voters in South Carolina said, no, we're good with the status quo. We want to elect a state superintendent. So it is by no means a slam dunk to say, well, we're just going to go from an elected position to an appointed position. It's a pretty heavy lift to amend the Constitution, as it should be.
Our Facebook watcher right now, Shannon Tharp, saying, I stand with elected officials by taxpayers not appointed because someone just likes them. So that kind of goes exactly to what you're talking about. Let's wrap up making the grade, Kevin, because obviously we'll be watching the state superintendent as she battles this lawsuit starting on Friday. But just because there are a couple more comments that came in, and obviously right here on Making the Grade, the hot button topic is going to be all summer is the reopening of schools in the fall, how that gets done, how it gets done safely, how it gets done for families. I want to go back up to Maria Gilmore had a comment for us. The hardest part, having two students, two different grades, 7 classes, only one Chromebook. They all have Zoom meetings at some point. They overlap those Zoom meetings. You know, it's all a real struggle. No doubt about that. And then Adriana, and if I'm saying your name right, I'm saying your name wrong, I'm so sorry, but I'm lucky to work from home, but I worry for my friends that don't fit that scenario necessarily. Daycares will have to work with schools. You know, you bring daycares into the mix in this with parents who are working. Valley View, she mentioned, as we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, moving to a 4-day week. Daycares being overwhelmed perhaps on that 5th day. All of these things, Kevin, are just one step in a cog that is completely clogged right now. And for nobody's lack of trying, it's just so unknown.
Exactly. And yeah, everybody's having to adjust to this in real time. And even though you've got the summer now to maybe take a breath as, you know, as parents, as educators, as administrators, you know, fall's going to be here quicker than you might think. And these same issues, these same questions, these same decisions are going to resurface because, you know, I think we had a commenter a few comments ago saying, you know, I hope we crush the coronavirus this summer. Who doesn't? We all do. We all want life to be back to normal. But, you know, unfortunately, the science does not suggest that that's a sure thing by any stretch. And we know that we're a long way from a vaccine. We know we're at least months away from a vaccine. The decisions that are going to have to be made about student safety, staff safety, community safety are going to have to be made in that backdrop, knowing that we still have to deal with the coronavirus and we still have to deal with trying to mitigate it and limit its spread. You know, these decisions aren't going to be any easier in the fall. The only advantage maybe is that we've had to make some of these decisions in the spring. We've got some experience to fall back on. And as we've said before, we have a little bit of time now to take a step back and look at what's worked and what hasn't worked, and try to build on this forced experiment, this forced experience from the past couple of months.
Totally agree, Casey Ann. I also wish summer would just crush the thing as well. Real fast, Kevin, Jenny Lee joining us again saying, let's clarify, are the individual schools going to get to decide, or will it be a district decision? So I think what she's getting at here is, you're going to have schools within the district, then you have the district level decisions, and then for that matter, you're going to have state level decisions. And at this point, all of it's on the table and it just depends, correct?
It really does depend. And all I can go back to is how the state handled the decision-making process in the spring. At first, Governor Little said, that he was going to leave the decision to close for the spring up to the local school districts. He resisted the idea of a statewide school closure at the same time that many other states were imposing a statewide school closure. So that's where he was in the spring. That's how he started out on this. Within a few days, so many schools had decided to close that the State Board of Education said, okay, let's take a time out. Let's close all schools for a month. Let's revisit this. And then, as we saw over the course of the spring, the State Board came out with guidelines that, really, all but, ruled out the idea of reopening schools. There was just so many restrictions in terms of class size and in terms of social distancing that, for all practical purposes, the idea of reopening public schools was more or less off the table as we moved into May. We really don't know, because we really don't know what the pandemic is going to look like in the fall. And, if you have, and we don't want this, obviously nobody wants this, where you have community spread in so many corners of the state, that's going to require a different response from the state than if you have numbers that are more or less under control in a lot of the parts of the state, but you have pockets of outbreaks and community spread that maybe have to be dealt with on a local level. We just know how the state had to respond in the spring. We just know how the state chose to respond in the spring. That's really the only thing that we can look to, as some sort of guidance, as some sort of predictor of how the state might respond in the fall.
I'll be curious, Kevin, when our dynamic here on making the grade changes, where there's going to actually be some sort of reportable information coming out of certain school districts, where it's coming from the state board. I know we've got the summer, but as you well said, we're already now into June. Schools start the end of August. Yeah. It's not that much time. So I know that those of you over at Idaho Education News are going to be watching the reopening of schools very closely. And I'm excited to be able to report right here live on Facebook to parents and grandparents and teachers and educators all over the state who are all dealing with this.
Yeah. It's not going to be much of a summer break for us. We're going to be very busy trying to get a sense of where we go from here.
Well, we appreciate all the reporting that goes on at Idaho Education News. Everybody, if you have not been to idahoednews.org, I highly encourage you to open up another tab right now and join them in their conversations with these stories, because not only are these topics there, but there are also a lot of other great stories from all around the state that deserve to be read and heard about so many incredible things going on in our state in education, even in the midst of a pandemic. So Kevin, please thank you.
And we've got politics to deal with too. I mean, really quickly, we've got election results tonight. We'll be looking at what happens with the school elections and what happens with some of these legislative elections that will shape education policy potentially. We will have some new faces in the legislature, one way or the other, and we've got some pretty important primaries that we're going to be watching tonight when we finally do get the election numbers. So we'll have full coverage. We'll have the numbers tonight. We'll have some breakdown and analysis later in the week. So, we've got plenty on our plate.
Welcome to June.
Yeah.
School's out, but, we're still here.
We're still here.
Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. We appreciate you being here for Making the Grade. Everybody, thank you for commenting. Continue to comment. Kevin and I will continue to look at those, and enjoy your Tuesday, Kevin.
You too.